We are live.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Bocheck, could you please lead off the questions?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Jamie, for a very detailed report. I have a list of questions here, and I'm sure we're going to forego our previous arrangement where we have 2 opportunities to speak on an important matter like this. I would like to start off by asking a question of Jamie of clarity, and perhaps one of the peer reviewers may be able to chime up on this as well. But Macy's Bay Road, I'd like to get clarity on when Macy's Bay Corporation takes over the responsibility of the road. Is it as of signing the agreement, or is it when they begin construction, or when they finish a phase of construction?
So I can answer that through you, Your Worship. In terms of, they never take over the road. It's still a municipally maintained road. But as far as the agreement, once the agreement's signed, there's an inspection that's required prior to any construction activity happening on the site. So what the intention is there is that the township engineer and the proponent's engineer do a visual inspection of the road. So they establish what the current standard and current condition is of that road so that it stays in that condition moving forward. And Macy Bay is responsible for any repairs as a result of the degradation from potential degradation from construction activity. So that's required before any construction happens.
Supplement to that, as everyone knows, in order to develop this property, there's going to be an immense amount of excavation equipment brought in to do this. And I'm thinking that a Class B road would not withstand the weights and pressures of floats and excavators and that being brought into the property. So the immediate damage to the road would be upfront. And that's my concern, is when is the responsibility of the road damage put onto Macy's Bay, but you've clarified that for me. And I'll refer or defer the rest of my questions until such a time where I can add it to someone else's.
Mr. Mayor, you're on mute.
Mr. Mayor should learn to unmute before he asks. Who else would like to ask some questions? Sorry about that. Councillor Jarvis.
Yeah, I thank Jamie Robinson for a very complete report. Obviously, well researched and done. A lot of, I share Councillor Bocheck's concerns over the state of the Macy Bay Road. Once construction equipment start moving along it, that's not a particularly high grade road to begin with. In my mind, having driven it a few times, it's almost like a long driveway, and that really doesn't, I don't think applies to heavy equipment going down it, but I presume that that's going to be dealt with. And that's part of my overall question is a lot of what we're talking about and a lot of what you summarized, Jamie, concluded with the fact that a lot of the stuff that is being done, been required, been filled out, all the peer reviews and everything, they talk about monitoring. And I'm really, really concerned that we talk about monitoring, but how is the monitoring going to take place? And who pays for the monitoring? And then how is all of this policed, and who pays for that? It's nice to say, oh yeah, we will monitor, for instance, the volume of, I'll use sewage because that's a big item in many respects. A lot of monitoring will go on. I presume there will be reports provided. I presume. I'd like to make sure that there's some way that we know that the reports are being filed and have people have access to them. How do you, if for instance, flows exceed what is part of the general description of the system, how is that going to be? How does the monitoring take place to begin with? And then two, if there is, as I said, if things are being exceeded, how is that going to be policed? As an example, I think environmental, freshwater, number of units, all that site plan control stuff you've been talking about. How does it get monitored? How do we police it? And who's going to be keeping an eye on it?
So through your worship, thanks for the question. So there's a couple things there. How is the monitoring going to take place? Who's going to police it? And I know you didn't bring this up, but I'm sure, I would imagine council's going to want to know what's going on and how like status reports effectively, I think is probably likely
Absolutely.
something
Yes.
that you're going to be interested in. So how does monitoring take place? So there's monitoring requirements in the site plan agreement, and those obligations are provided. The proponent has to undertake those monitoring requirements in terms of making sure they're being done correctly. There's a few different elements to it. So one is MOECP's required to, they're required to submit monitoring reports in accordance with their ECA. So that's kind of a separate thing from the township, but it's obviously something the township's interested in to making sure it's proceeding in the fashion that it's required to and regulated to. So I'll come back to that in 1 second. But for the other items like the environmental matters, for example, and the construction mitigation plan, making sure all those are implemented correctly. They will have to provide an engineering sign-off letter indicating the construction management plan's been implemented before we'll issue a building permit. And then we would send someone out to do an inspection to make sure it's been done accordingly. In terms of who pays for that inspection to be completed, the proponent pays for that inspection to be completed. It's just, I'll give it the similar example. If you're constructing a new, if a developer is constructing a subdivision road, for example, and it's going to turn into a municipal road at the end of the day, that developer has their engineer go out and follow the construction of the road. And then subsequent to that, the township also has someone go out there and has to provide sign off because they're taking it over at the end of the day. But those securities will be included. The securities that are collected will also include for the monitoring and the and those aspects of the development as well. So it gets paid for by the developer. That's not to say the reporting aspect of it and reporting back to council and this preparation of staff reports. I don't believe that would be, I think that would be the onus of the township that would fall on the township to complete those actual final reports that might come back to council for consideration or for information. But the costs lie on the developer for those items. And I guess one other thing is if the monitoring doesn't take place, then the proponent's in violation of the site plan agreement. And then the township can say this monitoring hasn't taken place. You're required to do in accordance with the agreement, and they're required to proceed with the monitoring at that time. But there will be a schedule outlined to complete all of those tasks.
Have some follow up there.
Councilor Jarvis.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Jamie, for that explanation. I'm just going to take one small item here. You mentioned under fire that there may be some equipment required. Then there's also this development charges. I know there are changes coming to development charges, and that's down the pipe. If the changes that are proposed in development charges do take place, at what point, or shoot, I guess, how are we on the hook for this? Development charges now, I presume, cover things like upgrading, correct me if I'm wrong, things like roads to accommodate the development and things like that. Where would we be on the hook for money going back to the developer if the development charges legislation changes?
Through your worship. So the only, so the item you've identified or the question you've you've put is that it makes an assumption that they would submit their building permit applications under protest. And let's say they were successful in having the LPAT rule that a lesser development charge was appropriate, and the township would have to give those funds back. So I can't really comment on the timing of that. I hope that's not a scenario that we get into. I would suspect that this DC appeal should likely be dealt with in advance of any building permits being taken out for the site, because realistically, if they're not getting permits for species at risk items until the fall, I think they'd be hard pressed to do any sort of development there until the springtime. And then you'd have the winter, for example, to sort out the development charges appeal on it. So I would expect it to be completed. But if we do get into that sort of a situation, what happens with development charges is they go into what's called a reserve fund. So when they're collected, they sit in a reserve fund, and the money would just come out of one of those reserve funds to pay back the portion that they might have overpaid for in the first place. So I think your real concern is there a liability on the township? And I think the answer is no, there's not a liability. The cash would be available in the development charge reserve funds.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Douglas.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie, for your report. It was really informative. I appreciate that. I too have concerns, as Councillor Bochek and Jarvis have already brought up, and just maybe a couple additional things. Some of the questions were answered. Being that this is a Class B road, I'm just kind of curious, because I'm not sure I'm understanding exactly is there anything in place once this development has been completed and is fully occupied for the additional traffic that will be on this road, and is it going to be sufficient enough, if they're basing it off the road that's there now, to accommodate that kind of traffic? And should they find that it's not, because it will be much heavier traveled, whose responsibility will it be to upgrade that road?
So through your worship, I'll just take that question as well. There was a traffic study that was prepared in support of the proposed development. That traffic study has been peer reviewed by the township's consultants, and it was determined that there's no specific additional upgrades to the road required from a pavement perspective or a widening perspective or a turning lane perspective to accommodate a volume of traffic that would be seen by the full build out of the site. What was required were those items that I mentioned in the presentation, such as the reduced speed limit, such as the additional signage, vegetation removal. And again, there is a requirement in the site plan agreement that the traffic volumes and the infrastructure be monitored so that it can be determined as the phasing of development proceeds whether any additional traffic mitigation or transportation items are required to be added or included. But the short answer is the studies did identify that there is no, to support the 180 units, yes, there will be more traffic, absolutely, but the current road is sufficient to withstand that volume of traffic.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to just ask another question here. Still kind of on the road situation, but I'm a little concerned that there's only one road going into this development for emergency vehicles. I'm going to say that that's probably standard for our township, but this is a fairly high density situation. And I'm just thinking on terms of, should we have, let's say, goodness forbid, but a forest fire, let's say, and the road is actually not traveled or not able to be traveled by our emergency vehicles. Is there any plan in place in those kind of situations? It's extreme, but it's quite possible.
There's no specific plan for if there's let's say there's an accident somewhere along Macy Bay Road on how access to the site could be obtained in an emergency situation. But from a standards perspective, the amount of development that exists today versus and with the amount that's included as a result of the 180 units that are proposed there, meet the standards for this road for having a single entrance location. And that's what the studies determine. So I don't really have anything additional to add on that other than it meets the technical requirements.
Okay, thank you for that.
Okay. Councilor Rienko.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. I have two areas I just want to explore right now. The first one is getting back to the road again. It sounded like from Jamie that the council's going to get an opportunity to be requested to put a speed limit of 30 miles, well, I guess it's 30 kilometers, I guess, on that road. And I wondered at that time, we could also probably suggest maybe putting some speed bumps in on that road. I know there can be seasonal bumps that can be put in, or there can be permanent speed bumps put in. But I think what the issue is I don't think speed limits, a lot of people abide by the speed limits. And so I think there might be an opportunity to look at putting some speed bumps along there. I think that's been mentioned before. So I want to get your comments on that. And then I have another question to follow up.
Certainly, if that's something council wanted to consider, the addition of speed bumps on any municipal road, they can do that. I'd suggest they should receive a report from the Director of Public Works on that, or make that request for a report to be outlined to establish the costs associated with that and the maintenance associated with that, and that could be brought to council certainly.
I just bring it up now so the other councilors can think about it and we can talk about it when you come to us with the speed limit. The other issue I think that that hasn't been addressed, and maybe if it has, maybe you can clarify, but being an aquatic biologist, I was wondering if there's any monitoring that would be going on, any shoreline or near shore or offshore monitoring that would be happening in the Macy Bay area, especially in some of the wetlands. As you know, we do have an off-site, an offshore sampling location right now, and this will be the third year of monitoring of that one site by the Seven Sound group. But I'm just wondering if there is a Georgian Bay water quality monitoring program that goes along with this development. And if not, I would suggest that there should be. Something that we can do is monitor the impact on our wetlands and then on our water quality offshore. Can someone comment on that?
I can comment on that. Not to my, so through your worship, to my knowledge, there's not any specific water monitoring component for Georgian Bay as a result of this development. And if I'm mistaken, then one of the sub-consultants can by all means jump in with some finish here. As far as from a policy perspective, and from a regulation perspective, the township planning documents wouldn't require that as part of this development. That's not to say it's not something that considered or offered. It's just not something that the documents specifically allude to or would require for the development of the site. So if I'm incorrect in stating there's no monitoring requirements as a result of this proposed for this development, someone can jump in, but I do not believe that to be the case.
Okay, so the issue is if I'll live with other councilors too to suggest it, but I suggest some kind of monitoring program, Georgian Bay water quality monitoring program be implemented. And I don't know how that gets done, but I think it should be part of the site plan agreement and especially some of the wetlands around that area that be monitored over the next several years. We do have a similar one down by Oak Bay. It's questionable if it's actually been implemented, but we did have one on Oak Bay, and I think this particular large development should have some kind of a water quality monitoring program. So I'm not quite sure how to get that into the site plan agreement, but and I don't know if I've got support from the councillors, so hopefully they'll speak up on it.
Could I, your worship, ask for an item of clarification on that point?
Please.
Councillor Wianco, were you looking for a sunset clause associated with that water monitoring, or would it be indefinitely, or what would the timing of that, what timing were you thinking about?
The kind of programs I've been involved in the past is a minimum of 10 years. So, so every year they would do some baseline studies. Maybe every 2 or 3 years they do more comprehensive study. And eventually after 10 years of final completion, so other words, after 180 sites have been developed, the clock starts ticking for 10 years. Again, it may not be a significant cost program. It could be added on, like SSCA is going to be in there anyway, so they could be added onto their program, or they can go to a private consultant or whatever. But I wouldn't mind seeing the details of that type of program and even have it possibly peer reviewed. So again, I think that some kind of water quality monitoring program should be part of this site plan agreement.
All right, thank you. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you very much, Mayor Kutzier. Just on the last point, I have a couple of questions, but I just wanted to point out that we've already engaged through Dr. Pat Shaw-Fraser water testing in the area. And that may be a way of dealing with this, not only this year, but at least will give us a baseline. And we would be able to perhaps continue on with the program that we have started this year. So I just wanted to make that point to Councillor Wianco that we've already started that last month. But I did have a couple of questions for Jamie. One is that sort of bottom line on the road, there's a lot of questions about the road. And you're, I think, saying, due to some studies that have been done, that this road needs no additional upgrades. So that's my first question. Having driven that road and adding 180 units, I'm really perplexed by that statement. And secondly, it was my understanding with the high water that we may even have some flooding on this road this year. Have we assessed that? And who knows, the water may come even higher. That's a very low-lying area. And so I am concerned about the road. So I guess the first thing is there will be no additional cost to the township of Georgian Bay in the foreseeable future with respect to Macy Bay Road, and the road is just fine. Thank you very much. Could you answer that first, please?
Certainly. So through you, your worship, in terms of there will be no additional cost to Macy Bay Road to the township in the future, I don't think I could say that unequivocally that there would never be a cost to Macy Bay to the township related to Macy Bay Road. The intent of the agreement is to ensure that if there's any damage to Macy Bay Road done as part of or that results from construction or the Macy Bay development, that it is Macy Bay that pays for that. The township may wish to do other maintenance or other changes to Macy Bay Road on its own outside of what this development might require. But that's what the specific intent of the agreement is to do. As far as the comment pertaining to no additional upgrades to the road required to accommodate, or the surface of the road required to accommodate development, or the additional 180 units. Those aren't my recommendations. Those are the recommendations that come from the experts, from the proponent's traffic engineer, and then from the township's engineer. So that's from their report. And then in terms of the flooding and the low-lying nature of it, Those items have not been considered as part of the preparation of our report. Just thinking through that, I would suggest that, yes, adding additional 180 units to a road that a portion of it may have issues related to high water. Would that make the problem worse? Certainly it would. But the problem would still exist with whether the development were to, whether 180 units were to be developed or not, the fact that there's water on the road. And it would seem to suggest to me that that's an outstanding issue that currently exists and probably shouldn't necessarily be borne entirely by the proponent in this case, that it's an existing situation. But that, again, I don't believe was reviewed or considered.
Subsequent to that, thank you, Jamie. And it's pretty clear from what you're saying to me that we could be in for a pretty big hit at some point, and that yes, of course, that we'd have to do something if there was some flooding, but also widening with 180 units. If this road doesn't need to be the height increased and widened to accommodate something like that, I don't know what would. But anyway, I'm very concerned about those costs and legacy costs for our township. But I want to just one other point of clarification. I have a lot of things I'd like to talk about today, but and I'll try and keep them very brief. But at the outset of your discussion or presentation, Jamie, you talked about and I'm looking for some clarification here, a public open house meeting. And I wrote this down because the term you used was a public open house meeting. And I want to understand if I'm correct, that there's a difference between a public meeting and an open house meeting. And specifically, as I understand it, a public meeting requires the meeting be dedicated to one matter, i.e. Macy Bay. And secondly, that the information and questions that come forth from the public at the meeting are minuted. And if we end up at the LPAT, that all that information is available at LPAT. Whereas at an open house, which we had last year, essentially that meeting, there were several other subject matters at the meeting, including Macy Bay, but other things that were going on. So it wasn't dedicated to this particular subject. So I want to be really clear in understanding why you use the term public open house meeting. Clarification, please.
Certainly, through your worship. The meeting that was held in July 2019 was an open house meeting that was open to the public, and that's why the terminology public open house meeting was used. It was a meeting where, yes, there was other, it was an open house meeting that the township hosted, and there was it was the September meeting where there were other items at it, but I can't tell you why the terminology was used other than I would say it's standard practice to host, if you're going to host an information meeting, to call it an open house meeting, but it was not any sort of statutory meeting under the Planning Act. The difference with a public meeting is public meetings are statutory under the Planning Act, and they are a council meeting. This was not a council meeting. It was not a statutory meeting. It was an information meeting. So we could have called it an information meeting. We could have called it an open house. But open house was the wording we used.
Just finally on that point, so in reality, we have not had a public meeting about this particular matter in the last 6 years since this matter came forward. Is that correct?
Yes, through your worship, there's never been an application that would require a statutory public meeting under the Planning Act or even precipitate one. So no, there hasn't been.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Hazelton, I believe it's your turn.
Why, thank you. I would like to focus my comments on what I'll call a combination of trust of organizations to take our interests of our community to heart and protect our community as our community is asking us to represent them and protect their interests. So I want to start off, what I'm saying is probably all public knowledge already. You've probably already read it, but I think it's worthy of repeating it. So the first thing that I want to highlight is MECP, who we have been relying on to focus on the septic system, did not do a technical analysis of the final design brief of the septic system, but went ahead and issued the ECA anyways. In fact, the expert from MECP has stated under oath that he wasn't involved after 2014, and yet the MECP received the ECA application in November of 2017, issued it in December of 2018, and yet with the OMB decision, paragraph 51 said in that OMB decision of March 16th, 2017, these are all issues that can be addressed through the site plan, MNRF, and MOECC processes. So here we have a situation where the OMB decision highlighted that there were significant opportunities for public input. We just heard from our planning consultant that there aren't needs for input through the site plan, and yet the OMB decision explicitly called out the need and availability for this. And so we have had a situation where the public input processes have been cut off. So that's one thing. So from a public standpoint, public participation, we've heard that we've had no public meetings. We've heard that the OMB decision had all this criteria, stated very clearly that there would be lots of opportunity for public input, and yet there has been no formal public input processes. I know that all of us have heard our communities screaming out to us on concerns regarding this project, and yet we continue to block the door and keep them from participating in public meetings. I want to then shift a little bit and talk about our friends, or perhaps not friends, at MECP. So we've heard today that this is a private project and the MECP could come in and shut down the project if there was things that would be failing. However, we are probably, and I hope all of us are well aware, that the JW Marriott Resort in Muskoka has had septic failures for the last 5 years, continues to have septic failures. MECP have been issuing constraints and corrective procedures, and none of those have been followed, and that resort continues to pollute the waters over on Lake Rosso. So do we trust that these monitoring strategies are going to be reasonable, successful, and prevent the pollution for our community? I think not. Further, Ontario, the province, developed something called the Lake Capacity Assessment Handbook, something that has been designed to help municipalities understand how to go about development on the Precambrian Shield. And we heard earlier that this is all Precambrian Shield. This planning tool is strongly recommended by the Ontario province, by the Ontario government, as an effective means of being consistent with the Planning Act and the provincial policy statement. So maybe I'm missing something, but when I read that, it would occur to me that if we want to be consistent with the provincial policy statement and the Planning Act, that we should have embraced this Lake Capacity Assessment Handbook, which, as I understand, we have not. So when we talk about how do we protect our community and our environment, that is a key document, which, by the way, MECP was a participant in creating, and yet nobody seems to have cared about it. And yet we as a council should feel responsibility to our community to care about things like this. Now, when we talk about what other things we might want to care about, we dutifully and I'm not saying that negatively, but we dutifully hear from our mayor at the beginning of every council meeting, a land acknowledgement statement. Have we reached out and spoken to the Indigenous communities and asked them what they think about the nature of this project? Well, I don't know if you have, but I have, and they are horrified with what is being planned. So there are lots of reasons, many of which or a few of which I've covered, but there are lots of reasons why we as council should be exercising perhaps the precautionary principle, which says when in doubt, where you don't have all of the facts, where you have one consultant that says one thing and other consultants who say other things, that we in fact should take a more precautionary approach, and that we should perhaps scale back the scope of things until we can feel confident that the project has the ability to comply with the kinds of standards that will protect our community. So far, I haven't seen the proof that those things are in place. In fact, if I can draw your attention to another project in our township, Oak Bay, which Councillor Bocheck is very familiar with. When Oak Bay was first implemented, there were all kinds of monitoring requirements that were required for Oak Bay. Have they been done? No. They have all fallen off the edge of the proverbial cliff, and therefore we have no real understanding of how effective Oak Bay is managing their environmental footprint. So here we have a situation where we want to believe that we have consultants in place who can do this, and we have policies and procedures in place to do that. But in fairness, we as a township have already demonstrated that we have failed. We've also seen that our so-called provincial ministry, who is supposed to be protecting us, has failed. They failed over in Lake Rosso. They have failed in their technical review of the matters in front of us already. Fortunately, the community has taken them to court for judicial review. It will be very interesting to see what comes out of that. But I think for me, there is overwhelming evidence that says what is being proposed should not exist in the scope and size of what it is, and the recommendations that have come in from various people in the community, not just one, various people, should be considered very seriously. And just kind of one final comment on that theme, if you will. I was delighted to hear Jamie say several times, in fact, he corrected himself a few times, when he was going to offer a statement. He said, in my opinion, in my experience, which thankfully we had him clarify that, because I have spoken with other legal and planning people who have different experiences and different opinions. And I think that it's important for us to understand that there are different opinions and experiences out there, and that we truly are in a position as council to freely make decisions and represent our community. And our community are telling us very strongly that they are not in favor of the size and scope and nature of this project. Thank you.
All right, Councillor Hazelton, thank you for those comments. I also have a couple of questions and comments before we go into the next round. My one question, Mr. Robinson, is throughout this process, is it my understanding that once council approves a site plan agreement, that basically council is done, that nothing more has to come in front of them? We have a project here that'll be going on the next maybe half dozen years or more. I don't know how long it's going to take them before the construction ends. But during that period, is there anything any reason that they will come in front of council? In other words, is this our last kick at this can, if I can use such crude wording?
So your worship, there's no specific need for them to come back to council for anything unless they would like a modification to the development that required Planning Act approval. So if they would need a minor variance for something or a zoning amendment for something or a change to the site plan from what they've currently proposed, then there'd be no need for them to come back to council. But if they proposed something that's not in the site plan agreement that gets entered into, then yes, they would have to come back to council to amend that agreement. But if they go ahead and build and construct in accordance with the zoning and in accordance with the site plan agreement that's in effect, there'd be no reason for them to come back to council to ask for approval for anything. That's not to say that council won't get updated on what's been occurring on the site and updated with respect to the monitoring aspects and those sorts of things and the reporting requirements with updates, but those would be items for information purposes.
Well, thank you. And because that is for me a great concern, because as we know in other developments that have taken many years, and Oak Bay has already been expressed as one example, that as the development evolves, everybody learns. They learn that some things work and some things don't, including they learn that some people won't buy one design, but they prefer another design. It can be anything from marketing to the initial residents deciding that something isn't appropriate. And I find it very frustrating that the developer doesn't necessarily have to listen to the residents as a whole if there's nothing that comes in front of council. And well, I certainly appreciate that we would be getting updates, reports of the monitoring and things like that if the monitoring takes place. You know, when they're for your information only type of report, that doesn't give council any real jurisdiction other than to make comment. But then speaking of the monitoring, I'm also quite concerned that, well, I greatly appreciate that in the report that you provided and in the proposed site plan agreement, there's lots of room for monitoring. But what penalties, if I can use the phrase, what penalties exist if this monitoring is not done? If this monitoring finds more harm is being done than was intended, or if some things just aren't working the way we thought they were going to work. And if it's one thing to say this is monitored and, oh, we found that we got a failing grade on this particular score and we did really well on that score. But what consequences are faced by the developer? What consequences are faced by the township if this monitoring at a certain point indicates that there is a fail? And I'm thinking very much about the effects on the environment and the neighbors. If the monitoring determines there's a fail, then what? Who's responsible? Who pays?
So I'll answer that question and then maybe Mr. Tzikis can add on to it a little bit. But what I'd like to just, in terms of who pays, not necessarily, there's not necessarily anybody or anyone that pays depending on the circumstance, but it is an agreement that they've entered into with the township. So if either party breaches the agreement, they're required to bring whatever that breach is into standard or into compliance with the agreement. And as you know, this site is a phased development. So for example, if they're in breach of the site plan agreement at any point in time, the municipality wouldn't issue building permits for them to proceed with future unit creation or future development on the site. So that is one thing that the municipality has the ability, or that's one thing that that would prevent, or one thing that the applicant would have to pay for, is that they would pay by not being able to proceed with additional development until that item's fixed. Secondly, that's one of the reasons why securities are collected and securities are kept as the development proceeds. If they're in breach of, let's say, an environmental matter or a buffer area, they're able to bring it back to the state that's required. If they don't, the municipality can draw on those securities to undertake that work. and we wouldn't provide them back the securities until the maintenance period associated with those features that had expired. So there are those, the securities are effectively an insurance policy to make sure they proceed with the things they're supposed to proceed with. I don't know, Chris, maybe there's anything, if there's anything that you'd like to add from a compliance perspective, by all means. I guess
I'm not seeing any response.
Okay.
Well, I'll ask my,
Can I be,
Oh.
sorry, can I be heard?
yes, now you can.
Okay, apologies. I'm not as technically advanced as most people. I think Jamie's description of it is fair. There is the agreement in place. There are, I would describe them as two key provisions that protect the municipality and the neighborhood. The first is the ability not to issue further building permits if any of the monitoring suggests that there are problems with what has been built or how it's been built. That extends during the life of the agreement and for some time after. And the second is the securities that Jamie has spoken about. But those are essentially the tools in the toolbox to ensure that things will go as anticipated. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to go one step further on the monitoring question, and that is with regards to the sewage system. Obviously, if the sewage system works, we'll all be very happy, and we can be optimistic that it will work. But I think we definitely need monitoring in the waters around the system and in the wetlands around the system to satisfy ourselves that it is working. And I want to know from you, and I'm glad that Councillor Hazelton brought up the Marriott example, because I was certainly going to do that if he had not. We know in the past there are systems that are under the MECP jurisdiction that have failed, and have failed repeatedly before anything was done. And so I would like to know if this sewage system were to fail, are the securities to clean it up filed with the township or with the province? And does the township versus the province or the province has the ability to shut down operations full stop until the system is solved? I know in the case of the Marriott, I'm not sure where it's status right now, but they were trying to dump the problem on the district. And I want to make sure that I want to be satisfied that we have this securities in place one way or another, that should this system fail to do the job it's designed to do, that our taxpayers will not be burdened with the cleanup, and our environment and neighbors won't be burdened with the consequent pollution.
So through your worship, I can do my best to try to answer that. I'm by no means an expert in sewage systems aspects, but from a securities perspective, the securities that are in place are not to deal with cleanups or potential spills. The securities that are in place are to deal with if infrastructure fails, to ensure that it can be fixed if it's not fixed in a timely manner by the proponent. And it's really to bring it to the site to a state that it's not to be an operational, let's say, system that people are using. That onus falls on the proponent as an individual landowner and property owner. So our securities, again, are not to deal with spills or those sorts of things. I would suspect that if there is a problem with the system, or if there is a spill with the system, there'd be an order, there'd be a time to comply, And if necessary, there could be fines instituted by the ministry for not operating in accordance with the certificate that's been provided by them. It is complicated because obviously there are some cross-jurisdictional issues between the township and MOECP approval authority. And I'm not sure if Chris has anything. I see he's unmuted. I don't know if he has anything to add to that as well.
I can thank you through you, Mr. Mayor. If the system fails and the ministry issues an order and it's not complied with and the permit is revoked, the municipality has the ability to shut down the operation. So that's an added point that I would give to you. It doesn't change what Mr. Robinson has said. It simply supplements it by that one point.
Well, I think that's an extremely important point. Thank you. If the municipality has the ability to shut down the operation, though I am deeply concerned that if there is any sort of spill, that we don't have any security towards cleaning it up, and that could lead to many years in court, of course. Though the optimist in me is hopeful that we will never reach that point. I think we just have to be prepared for it. I think, even though I have a few other comments and questions, I think perhaps we should start another round and let other councillors speak again with additional questions. Who would like to? Councillor Bocek, followed by Councillor Cooper, followed by Councillor Douglas. Those are the hands I've seen so far.
Thank you, Mayor Coates here. A few technical problems or issues I could see in the future. And one of them, I was hoping that our fire chief would be involved in the conversation here, but perhaps one of the peer reviewers could help with this, or Jamie. This is a seasonal facility that will be in operation for approximately 8 months of the year. The other months, the property will be closed down. Sprinkler systems only work when there's water pressure. And my understanding is that the water system would be completely cleaned out, pressurized with air over the winter season, which would make the sprinkler systems completely inadequate. Our fire department then would have to use a pumper truck because there is no hydrants or any facilities there. So my concern is A, that during the shutdown period of this park, that there would be no water pressure to make the sprinkler systems active, and B, that there would need to be some sort of agreement where snow clearing, especially with that northwest exposure, snow clearing during the winter months is mandated, that all the main roads and trails are kept open to give accessibility to our fire department to get in there. We have a responsibility for personal property and persons, and I don't believe it can be achieved if there's no water on site. So that's one concern I have. Jamie, if you want to address that before I go to my second point.
Sure, I can address that. Those are discussions that have been held with the fire chief and with the proponents in terms of winter fire maintenance. So you're correct in your description of the site only operating seasonally and the water system being drained during those time periods. The intent is that fire services would be provided for the maintenance building and those primary areas of the site during the off season, we'll call it, but that fire services wouldn't necessarily be available for the trailered areas of the site during the periods that the site's closed down and there's snow on the ground. That's an insurance matter associated with the proponent, and the intent is that that they are comfortable that there would not be firefighting. The municipality would not provide firefighting to those areas of the site during those off seasons. That information is outlined in the firefighting strategy is outlined in the site plan agreement. And one of the key aspect and the reason for the sprinklering isn't necessarily for like property maintenance is part of it, but it's the public health and safety aspect of it that's sort of paramount. So the idea is that there is nobody on the site in those months where the facility is closed down. So the hydro, everything should be shut off to all those units. So unless there's a natural disaster, it's not anticipated there would be a need for any fire suppression in those months. But that has been fully talked about and fully addressed in the site plan agreement to the applicant and the fire chief's satisfaction.
Thank you for that, Jamie. Secondly, when we approved the phased development of Oak Bay at the very beginning, we noticed changes to the municipal and district environment around the development. We never had a stop sign in Port Severn at the main intersection. We had to have special ramps constructed and stop signs, and a turning lane put in off of Honey Harbor Road to accommodate. And we're only talking about a 40 unit build out in phase 1 of Oak Bay, yet there had to be a turning lane on Honey Harbor Road in order for them to get site approval. So my question is, it's a very, very narrow passage on Honey Harbor Road where it enters into the Macy's Bay. And I can't understand why it was not mandated that a turning lane be put in there on a weekend when you have 180 units populated by probably 4 people per unit, all coming up in vehicles. That adds an additional 500 vehicles to that road on a weekend. You can just imagine the people trying to get into Honey Harbor that won't be able to continue through because the road will be blocked from people trying to turn down Macy's Bay Road. So why did we not require a turning lane on Honey Harbor Road before this development gets underway?
So all I can add on that is that the technical studies that were, and I think I've alluded to this already or provided a response to this, is that the technical studies based on the volume of traffic, didn't necessitate the road didn't necessitate the need for upgrades or turning lanes at that intersection. Again, there's monitoring required, but the traffic counts based on the size of the proposed development did not necessitate that. I don't know, Claude, is there anything else that you'd want to provide on that answer from a technical perspective?
Thank you, Your Worship, through to Councillor. The traffic impact study was prepared by the proponents specialists, and it was reviewed by our senior transportation engineers, and they agreed that the report was properly done and concluded that there was not a need for a left turn lane at this intersection.
So supplement to that, Jamie, would be, why was it mandated that Oak Bay have a turning lane with a far less built out development, and it's not part of the infrastructure we're looking at for the Macy's Bay project?
Through Your Worship, I'm not sure the specifics associated with that. I could hazard a guess, and that guess might be a result of the other amenities that go along with Oak Bay. So specifically the golf course, the banquet facility, and the traffic that's potentially generated by those uses in addition to the residential uses may have mandated the requirement for that, but it would be a result of the traffic volumes and counts specific to that development. So I don't know the details, but I'm hazarding a guess based on what I do know.
Thanks, Jamie. Of course, these questions are arrived at my email via constituents of mine. They're not necessarily concerns directly of myself, but there is a large cry from people about this turning lane, and it was incumbent upon me to ask the question. Yeah. If I may, through you, Mr. Mayor, add one more. My concern all the way along has been the waterfront development, and you've stated many times that part of the application process for site plan approval does not include the waterfront. My concern is, and always has been, that when you develop a property to 180 sites, those people didn't come up to sit and look at a septic system. They came up to boat, fish, be on the bay. I can only imagine that 90 boat slips are going to need to be there for the 180 boats that are eventually going to be there. And without knowing what docks, marina shops, gas pumps, sewage pump outs from these boats, whatever, there's a lot of infrastructure going to happen on the waterfront here eventually. And once we approve a site plan for 180 units, it kind of says to everybody, well, we've got these 180 units in here. We need docking facilities for these people. And the process can be very skewed towards the developer on this waterfront. And I'm going to ask this question again. Why do you not feel it relevant to get some sort of picture of what's going to happen on the waterfront? Because we know it's going to happen. You don't build a facility like this on Georgian Bay without having access to Georgian Bay. Why have we not seen anything or have any indication of what's going to happen with this waterfront development in the way of docks, boat slips, marinas, etc.? And yet we're expected to approve a 180 unit facility knowing this is coming.
So through your worship, just a couple points on that is firstly, there's no requirement under the plan, because I'm going to speak as a planner here, and obviously I've been speaking as a planner the whole time, but there's no requirement under the Planning Act that there be a waterfront plan submitted associated with this development. And there's no requirement that the site plan include that component. I do appreciate your comments that, and I'd like to just say it's reasonable to expect that there will be an additional demand on the waterfront as a result of the trailers and the development that's proposed here. I don't think we can guarantee that it will happen, but it's reasonable to expect that that might happen. When that happens, or if that happens, that portion of the site plan would have to be considered through an amendment to this existing site plan, and there'd be studies required associated with that, such as a boating impact study and those sorts of things. But we can't absolutely guarantee that's going to happen now. I can tell you I have spoke with the proponent about this matter and what do they anticipate to occur here. They anticipate that there will be people in this development that are boaters, and there will be people in this development that enjoy fishing and recreation on the water, and there will be people in this development that aren't active in those areas of recreation. What they have identified is that there are a number of marinas, both in Georgian Bay and Port Severn, that do support boating, access to water, fishing opportunities, and there's municipal launches as well. And they expect that, and there's also a launch on the site. They do expect that the recreational opportunities associated with the water will be distributed amongst those existing available opportunities. But there is no requirement at this point in time to include that as part of the application. So as a planner, I'm not able to give you an opinion about what might occur or what would be reasonable, but I'm required to give you an opinion based on the application that's before us and been presented. And that's what I believe that we've done.
Sure. I understand that as a planner, that's your opinion. However, my constituents don't have the same opinion. They feel that there will be a large build out impacting the shoreline and the water here. And that's all part and parcel. So I respect your position on that, Jamie. And I will certainly return to my constituents and relay that information to them. Thank you.
Thanks.
That's it for me, Mr. Mayor, for now.
Thank you. Councillor Cooper, I had you next on the list, followed by Councillor Douglas, followed by Councillor Wienko.
Thank you, Mayor Kutzier, and certainly very interesting questions. And I do have a few things I'd like to talk about here, but just as with respect to the questions, I was making some notes, and my main comment is that there are a lot of vagaries here. Fire protection, waterfront, sewage, roads, the cost. These are all big questions, and I don't see all the answers. So that's just based on the questions I saw, but I thought it would be also helpful it certainly was for me. I just sort of sat back and tried to think about this development and what were the benefits. And I just wanted to remind myself that during the run up to the 2018 election, this development became a central issue for many of our voters. Many of us made a commitment to our electors that we would do our utmost to protect the environment, while at the same time trying to achieve a better ROI with tax dollars that the townships receives from our constituents. In fact, our township strategic plan aligns with the very same objectives. So I just wanted to remind us of that. And with respect to that, I sort of started asking questions such as, what is the environmental benefit of this development? We know that right behind this development, there's a huge PSW, Toby's Bay wetland. According to scientists at various organizations on Georgian Bay, including the Georgian Bay Land Trust, Toby's Bay is the most significant and diverse PSW, especially in terms of SARS, species at risk, on Georgian Bay. And we have to remember that Georgian Bay, Eastern Georgian Bay, is the largest area of wetland and species corridors in Canada. So this is, from an environmental perspective, what's the benefit? I get worried about it. The sewage works that was approved by MECP does not match up with the increased density of trailers that were granted by the OMB in March of 2017. So I think it's important for us to remember that. It sort of appears that it may be inadequate, and that will not be decided until the judicial review. So we've got another vagary. I'm talking about these vagaries that we've had. So I have difficulty with this from an environmental perspective. What is the socioeconomic benefit of this development? And I think it appears that there could be very high costs for our ratepayers, socio and economic. What are the true costs, as we've referred to, the roads, et cetera? What sort of security deposits we have? Some, it appears, but not for everything. So I think we need to be mindful of that. And I remind myself of a line that I like very much, which was, the environment is the economy, or conversely, the economy is the environment. And this is a very important aspect to us. And I think it really relates to our Macy Bay development that's in front of us today. I asked myself one other question. Did we get the benefit of feedback from the public? There's not been a single public meeting, and that's been admitted to this morning. Since 2014 when this project came forward. I find that remarkable. But I think many of us sort of made commitments to the public to advocate on their behalf. And I've heard from communities from in the north, 12 Mile Bay to Moore Point, and everything in between, be it Wawatasi, Goulham Bay, Cognisheen, Honey Harbor, Macy's Bay. There are a lot of concerns raised by these communities. Also from pan-Georgian Bay organizations like the GBA, Georgian Bay Association, and the Georgian Bay Land Trust, et cetera. There are a lot of organizations that have raised questions. I would add also that we even have had concerns raised by people from our neighboring archipelago. People from that far away are saying, what are you doing? So I have real concerns, especially about the magnitude of this. So I'm finally going to say that I don't understand why we would approve 180 units, and we're being told we have to. I'm sorry. We have other advice that says we can reduce this number significantly. The OMB decision said up to 180. It didn't say you had to approve 180. So I think we need to think about that. So my suggestion is that we, if nothing else, we do this in phases, And I would think that it might be in phases of 30, but only to 90 or something along those lines. So I throw that out as a consideration, and I rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Douglas, you're next, followed
Thank
by
you.
Councillor Yanko.
I too have just been listening to what everybody's been saying, and I have a couple of comments and concerns. Of course, like most councillors. One thing that's really concerning me, and I know this has been talked about and has been covered sort of, but I'd like a little bit more detail on it, is the monitoring system. I think it's great that we have monitoring systems in place, but you know, the township could have extensive legacy costs if we don't have proper wording in that to be able to resolve any issues that might be in dispute between the proponent and the township as to whether the monitoring system is correct, or if we agree that it is actually in fact what their experts may be saying. And I'm just wondering, you know, from a legal perspective, I would really hate for I would really hate to see that there be some sort of dispute, and where this ends up is sort of in a courtroom, which takes years and years and years. And in the meantime, let's say perhaps it would be over, whether it be over the road or the septic system or other, take many, many years to get it resolved. To Chris, can you tell me when there is a dispute on the actual accuracy of what we feel is adequate in the monitoring system?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, the site plan agreement is generally designed so that the monitoring must meet the requirements and the standards of the municipality. We have what I will call the final voice on these things, and if we don't agree, there may be a dispute, but in the meantime, we do not issue building permits. That I think is the hammer, if I can call it that your question refers to.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that's an answer that is important for us all to know, is that we do have final say should we have some issues come up. The road in particular is concerning, and as well as the septic system. However, I'm a little worried about the cross between jurisdictions on the septic issue. So again, I am a little bit worried about the fact that we may not have full control on that. The road we may have other not as much problem with, but just another question that just a follow up to what Councillor Cooper was saying. Do we have the legal right to request that we have less units than the 180 proposed?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, if I may, in my opinion, the answer to that is no. The Ontario Municipal Board has decided that this property's density is what it is. Indeed, that took us back, I think, the hearing to the decision made in 1996. It's one thing to deal with things in a phased way, as we are trying to do in this site plan agreement. It is quite another to say that you believe that 180 is inappropriate and you're going to take it down to 90 or whatever. I believe that would be challenged. I believe it would be challenged successfully.
Thank you, Chris.
Councillor Yanko.
My question now is more or less process. In listening to the various councillors talking today, it sounds like we like to make some modifications to the site plan, and I'm not quite sure how we do it, or if we even can. like we talked about, Councilor Bochek talked about the waterfront development and also a turning lane. And I talked about doing a Georgia Bay water quality study. How do we get either agreement or denial from the rest of the council to modify the site plan agreement? Or can we modify the site plan agreement today to have these additionals made to it? Or do we have to go through another process? So how do we get agreement to change, or can we change the site plan agreement today? Everybody's arguing against making changements right now. So are we just spinning our wheels here, or can we actually make serious changes to the site plan agreement?
Maybe I'll start, and if Chris has anything to add, he can add to that, Your Worship. Through the resolution, you could provide some specifics to the resolution and items to be included in the draft agreement that gets prepared. But you are somewhat limited, but bear in mind that it is an agreement between two parties. It's an agreement between the township and the proponent, and they too would have to agree to those changes, and we don't have them here today. So I'd have to think about how the resolution gets worded, but it would, if you're agreeing to approve the site plan agreement, for example, with a few additional modifications or a few additional principles included, then I think you could do that. And what would transpire is either A, the proponent would agree to those modifications and enter into the agreement, or B, they would not agree to those modifications, and and their opportunity would be A, to appeal the site plan, the non-decision on the site plan agreement or the decision that council has made, or B, to come back to council. We'd have to come back to council to reconsider the language of those items. But maybe Chris can just confirm if I'm on the right track there.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, in direct response to the councillor's question, I think your options today are to agree to this site plan agreement, to not agree to this site plan agreement, and to make it subject to various modifications, which we would then invite the proponent to consider with us so that we could bring back another document to you, or to decline this site plan agreement. I suppose the fourth option is to simply make no decision on the site plan agreement. Those are what you can do. So if there are modifications that you would like to see to the agreement before reconsidering it, they can be part of the resolution. That would be instruction to me and to Mr. Robinson to invite further discussions with the proponent. What their reaction to that invitation would be, I'm not sure. They have been in a position to appeal the site plan process for more than 3 years, 3.5 years almost. They have not done so. I take from that an interest in trying to work things out rather than trying to work things out at LPAT. So if that's any guidance to you, I hope it's helpful.
So to follow that up then, I personally like to see some kind of a water quality monitoring program. It wouldn't be all that expensive, but I'd like to see that included in this particular resolution. Other councillors may want other things to add it to the resolution, but unless I hear some denials from the rest of council against having a water quality study, I'd like to have it added to the resolution.
All right, thank you. Councillor Jarvis. presumably followed by Councillor Hazelton because he hasn't spoken in this round.
I like Councillor Yanko's idea of adding that idea, water quality testing to the to a resolution would be something I would be in favor of, definitely. What else I'm going to say are comments that have already been covered. I just support both Councillor Cooper's recent comments and Councillor Hazelton's earlier comments with regards to certain aspects of this whole development that I find disturbing. And one of the reasons I came onto council was to try and sort things like this out, or help sort things like this out. My understanding is that when this project was originally envisioned, they were going to be 50 square meter trailers, everything based on sewage treatment right through all the other development, the OMB hearing, everything was based on 50 square meter, I guess they are size trailers, whatever it is. We're now looking at trailers that are going to be twice the size of those originally envisioned, in a park with 180 units, 180 units at 50 square meters versus 180 at 100 square meters is a significant difference in what could possibly be occupied in each of those trailers. I am very, very doubtful based on that volume and other comments we've seen from the public on the sewage treatment system, whether it has a capacity to handle any of this. So I'm very, very concerned in that regard. From day one, it was my understanding there would be public input all the way along on many of the different articles required by the OMB. And as has been stated, there's been almost no public input whatsoever in that regard. So I think the democratic process has really been curbed in that regard. I'm very, very concerned in that way. If we could, I understand there are obviously ways that the developer can appeal whatever we decide today if it's not just a straight site plan agreement. But if it's 90 units we could agree on as opposed to 180, because that would be similar from the standpoint of effluent from my perspective, or certainly the level of occupation in those units, then I'd be comfortable with that. But I'm certainly not comfortable approving a site plan agreement for 180 units here today. Thank you.
Councillor Hazelton.
I was delighted to hear our mayor talk about his concerns about council and the township being able to weigh in on the project over time. He seemed to be suggesting that he was uncomfortable with the fact that we would approve and then we would never get an opportunity to revisit, come back to the table and discuss things. That's a huge concern of mine. It's a huge concern of the community. I would like to remind everybody that back in February, council passed an updated site plan bylaw where council is delegating all of their Section 41 of the Planning Act responsibilities to the township planner, which really means once we approve this thing, we are done. Public input is over. Paths for public input are done forever. It's purely a township staff and developer or Macy Bay Company matter. As far as I'm concerned, any of us councillors who would vote for that kind of approach, unless we like a one-term, or in my case, a one-term councillor, that would be the end of it. I can't imagine any community ever re-electing us to do anything in this township if we cut off our community's input. Sadly, I have to report that there are other legal opinions about whether we can approve a different number. So we can kind of agree to disagree that with our resident lawyer. But I have taken the liberty of working with external legal matters to draw up an amendment to the proposed resolution that it may be appropriate to review here As I say, I'm formally proposing an amendment to the resolution. And in this proposed resolution, what I'm suggesting, essentially, it's fairly simple, that we proceed with a maximum of 90 sites, but without prejudice to the applicant to seek to amend the maximum number of sites at a later time. That kind of process doesn't state you don't get any more ever. It just gives us as a council, as a township, an opportunity to say, go ahead, start your project, go partway down the path. And we've had all of these comments about all this monitoring opportunity, et cetera. Well, we would actually have an ability to be re-involved as a council and township to represent our community, so that the applicant would then at some point in time in the future come back and seek to amend the maximum number of sites. That to me, and certainly to the community that I represent, which is all the way from Macy Bay and north to the top end of Honey Harbor. But as Councillor Cooper said, a huge, huge community who are very, very concerned with this project. And this kind of amendment would give us a seat at the table to discuss things in the future, such that we can ensure as a council that the monitoring is being done properly, that our residents in the community are being respected, that the environment is being respected. So I would like to proceed with that amendment.
Okay, what I'm going to do now, everybody's spoken for 2 times, and Councillor Hazelton ended all our comments with a suggestion of a modified resolution. I want everybody to make a quick comment. I mean, as our lawyer, Mr. Tzika, suggested, we basically have, in my mind, 4 choices in front of us. One would be to agree to the site plan agreement as presented. The second, obviously, would be to disagree, to deny it and just vote it down. A third one would be to, he called it not make a decision, basically defer and say, you know, ask staff to come back the following month based on all the comments we've made. And the fourth one would be to actually call it a better deferral, in the sense that we would add all sorts of comments now in the form of a resolution that would suggest to our staff things that we would like to see. While I fully respect that this would have to be discussed with the applicant, because an agreement does involve 2 parties, and I think we have to be very clear that there are 2 parties here, and as the township is one of those parties, and so we should have the opportunity to put input into this agreement. So I'd like to hear from everybody out of those 4 choices: agree, deny, defer, modify, which way you're leaning. And then if we want to modify, then we have to start collecting the various bits of input we want to add or subtract from the current resolution. Who wants to start? Councillor Douglas.
I have one point of clarification. I just wanted to ask in regards to a comment that Councillor Jarvis brought up. Can it just be confirmed for me that in the OMB hearing that the part of the information was based on 50 square meter buildings? Can that be confirmed by Chris, please?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the Ontario Municipal Board decision spoke of 180 trailers with a maximum size of 100 square units.
Okay, thank you.
That's very specific to the agreement, and that was what the OMB decided.
Okay, thank you for that. Also, just in regards to your comment, Mayor Coetzee, I personally leaning towards modification. I agree that on a number of points here, one would be with Councillor Wienko's water quality testing. I think that should be part of what goes into place. Or are you just wanting to hear from us at this point which way we're leaning?
I think that what you've already provided is very useful for the rest of us, and as we go along, other people may have other topics. And then once I've done this little survey, I think what I'm going to propose is, depending upon where we head, either take the vote or take a lunch break while we put together some notes so that we come back after lunch and modify the resolution, if that's the direction council wants to go.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Cooper.
Defer to someone else.
Thank you, Mayor Kutzier. I'm leaning to option 4. I might call it 4A or something, or 4 plus, in that we have a suggestion that has come forward from Councillor Hazelton, and so that's a modification. So that's one thing that we could do today is actually do a modification based on what he has to bring forward. So that's an option, but I am definitely suggesting that there needs to be modification. I couldn't possibly agree to pass this as it stands. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bocek.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A little background. I'm not satisfied with the MOCP's ability to monitor, or that we have any assurance that anything in this sewage treatment is going to be monitored, what the schedule for monitoring is. I have firsthand account of owning a resort that has over 10,000 liters a day that I owned for 9 years, not one visit from the ministry. I sold it to a fellow who owned it for 10 years, not one visit from the ministry. The current owner has had it for 4 years, not one visit from the ministry. Even with numerous complaints from neighbors that the system was failing, that it was inadequate. Tay Township, the MOCP, there was no mediation, there was no action taken. So as a firsthand account, I can see that there's a lot of questions to be answered in the monitoring and reporting of the septic system. And for this reason, I'm willing to deny the application and vote no. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Jarvis.
One, I appreciate the correction to my comments with regards to the trailer size. I'm thinking back now that obviously I was wrong, so I'll accept that. But I think I was not trying to mislead. I'm hoping that perhaps clarification come in some other way, but to my knowledge, it must have been the septic system that was based on originally 50 square meters as opposed to 100. But anyway, besides the point, I was corrected on that. My initial response is to deny, as Councillor Bocek has said. I understand that there are certain consequences associated with that might be more severe than if we went with option number 4, which we might be able to defend to a much greater degree. I'm agreeing, though, that that's septic sewage system is highly questionable in my mind, and monitoring also would be even more questionable. So yeah, I'd be happier to deny, but I would be accepting of option number 4. I think, though, the water quality would be something we want to put in on that as well.
Councillor Hazelton.
Number 4.
Okay, and Councillor Wienko.
I think we have to, I like to consider number 4 because we would make a list of the things that we would like to have added to the site plan control. And let's say we added, let's say, a half dozen. There could be negotiations between our staff and the proponents as to what ones would be accepted. Maybe the proponent might only accept 1 or 2, but then I would be a much better position to accept or deny the process, knowing that they've had another chance to look at our concerns. But just denying it today, it doesn't give our legal staff anything to argue against. There's no rationale for the denial. So I think if we do a modified and come back next month and to find out where our proponent sits on these various additions, then we can say, have much better position, which is to approve or deny. So I'd rather go for the modification right now.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I think my take is I was personally not willing to agree to the agreement as it currently stands, but I was also not inclined. I didn't want to deny it because I think, we want to get to some conclusion, and we respect the fact that the OMB has made some decisions with regards to zoning. So I'm also agreeing to the modification, and I'm going to propose, now being it almost 10-1, that we break for a quick lunch break and reconvene at 1:20, and at that time make the listing of things that we'd like to see in a modified agreement. I think I'm hoping that the developer, the applicant will be patient with us, especially when I learned that they're probably not going to get a ruling from the MECP or approval from the MECP until this fall, which probably will slow down construction until next spring. I think waiting an extra month it shouldn't be a hindrance to them, and I think our responsibility to our constituents would suggest that we should actually put some extra components into the agreement that we would like to have with the applicant. So with that, I'm going to suggest we break for lunch and come back in 30 minutes. So Councilor Bocek, you want to add a quick comment?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I think we've misunderstood, or some have misunderstood, what our legal advice from Chris Tzikis was. He never offered that option as an alternative. And you can correct me, Mr. Tzikis, on this, but you said there was 3 options, not a 4th option, because they've already been approved for the 180 units. And if this was proposed as an option, I think the LPAT would rule against it. It'd be a very costly procedure. But I'm not an expert, so I'm asking our solicitor to comment on that, because you didn't think that the lower number of units was an option for us. Do you still feel the same way?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, if I may, I did think there were 4 options available to you, Councillor. They were, as the mayor has described, to deny the agreement, to approve the agreement, to defer making a decision on the agreement, or to defer with modifications. Those are the options available to you. I believe that if the modification is that the site plan agreement caps the approved development at 90, even if it is on a without prejudice basis, as has been suggested, I think that is subject to challenge. So my opinion on that hasn't changed. I understand there are legal opinions out there that are different than mine. I have never seen them. I don't know who gave them. I don't know the basis on which they were provided. So I can't fight ghosts. I simply tell you what I believe your position is. The issue of the number of units has been decided at the board. I do not think that will change.
And just a question of clarity, Chris, was you said defer with modifications. I think what I was hearing from Councilor Hazelton and Cooper was approve with the modifications. Can you just be clear that approving the application with modifications is an option, because you said defer with modifications?
Sorry, my expectation was that if there were modifications added to the agreement, if they can all be articulated in the time that you have, wonderful. I'm assuming it may take some time and some discussion for you to get to that laundry list. And in the meantime, you would not be prepared to approve. But that's why I was using the word defer with modifications. if you believe that all the modifications can be set out succinctly and that the agreement can be approved subject to these modifications, I think it takes us one step further down the road.
I think that'll help us digest things over lunch, and I appreciate your comments.
Okay, thank you. With that, Way, I almost called you Counselor Way, but Clerk Way.
Sorry, I'm going to start drafting something over the lunch period. The main two consistent items that I'm hearing is 90 units and water monitoring. Can I just get some confirmation on that? And I know there's
also the road,
and
Honey
the
Harbor Road, the turning lane. Those are the three things that I've picked up on. Even though, if I can interrupt, which I'm clearly about to anyways.
You already have.
Dr. Pat Fraser, as Councillor Cooper said, is already doing testing in that area, and she's going to report back to us next year. And then from that point, we're going to determine if that's something we want to continue on our own or have someone else do. So in my opinion, that part's already covered.
Except that if it's not the response, it would be the responsibility of the applicant to help cover those costs.
Correct.
That has not been covered.
Right.
Councillor Douglas.
Just to add one more thing in there that I think is really important, and it's been touched on a number of times, and that is that we have some sort of separate agreement with the proponent, or this discussed anyways, to have jurisdiction over the septic system should MOECP not step in a timely fashion. And I'm not sure that that's even possible, but this is a negotiation, this is a contract, and I think just about anything can be agreed upon. But I think that's very important that, I mean, obviously there's been history here that monitoring really hasn't been done in the past on other projects. So I think that's a very important thing that we add into this, some way of having some jurisdiction that the township can step in and do its own monitoring if necessary.
Councillor Hazelton, followed by CEO Gunby. So much for lunch.
So much for lunch. So in the spirit of formal meeting process, we have a resolution on the table. I have provided Karen with wording for an updated resolution and matching bylaws to satisfy this strategy of maximum 90 sites. What's important, I think, also for us to realize is the OMB didn't say that that the site was good for 180 sites. They said up to 180 sites. And there's lots of confusion on the concept of a park model unit, 50 square meters, 100 square meters, et cetera, which still has never been resolved from a legal standpoint. So I would like to suggest that because I've made an amendment and I've provided Karen with the wording of that amendment, that that be, from a meeting process standpoint, be considered as we go forward. Thank you.
Okay, CEO Gunby.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. I was just going to say that when we do break, which I'm hoping is in a couple minutes, because I would also like to see the phase 3 that Doug Ford's announcing at 1 o'clock. I am going to call our CBO and just get an answer for you, Councillor Douglas. I don't think we have the jurisdiction over the septic if MOE does not monitor, but I would like to verify that, and I will have that answer for you when we come back.
Okay, we're now breaking before anybody else sticks their hand up at 12:57, and I expect everybody to be back by 1:30. How's that? Half an hour. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you.